Flowers are the most beautiful part of the plant. Flowers are the reproductive part of the plant. In the flower, stamen is the male reproductive part and carpel is the female reproductive part. Some flowers contain both male and female reproductive parts. Such flowers are called bisexual flowers. For example, pea and China rose. On the other hand, some flowers possess either the male or the female reproductive parts. Such flowers are called unisexual flowers. For example, corn, cucumber, etc. Now let us know about the different parts of the flower. Flower contains two parts, reproductive part and non-reproductive part. The stamen and carpel are the reproductive parts of a flower. Stamen is the male reproductive part and carpel is the female reproductive part. Stamen is made up of two parts, anther and filament. The anther produces pollen grains. This anther produces pollen grain. Pollen grain is the male gamete of the flower. Carpel is made up of three parts. The terminal part is stigma, the middle elongated part is style, and the swollen bottom part is ovary. Inside the ovary, ovules are present. Ovules contain the female gamete called egg cell. For sexual reproduction, male gamete should fuse with the female gamete, thereby forming a zygote. Now for that, the male gamete have to reach the female gamete. Pollen grain contain the male gamete and the ovule contain the female gamete. Now we can understand how this male and female gamete will fuse in the flower. For this, pollination should take place first. You have learned about pollination. It is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma is called pollination. You look at this definition. The transfer of a male gamete. Here pollen grains contain the male gamete. So the transfer of male gamete from the stamen of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or to the another flower is called pollination. If the pollen grains lands on the same flower from anther to stigma of the same flower, it is called self-pollination. But if the pollen grains of the flower lands on the stigma of another flower of the same species is called cross-pollination. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. There are two types of pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. In self-pollination, the pollination is happening in the same flower or different flowers of the same plant. But in cross-pollination, pollination is happening between two plants of different flowers. Did you understand the difference here? Self-pollination, only one plant is there, but it can happen in the same flower or it can happen in the different flowers of the same plant. But in cross-pollination, there will be two plants and pollination will happen in between two different flowers of the same species. Pollination occurs with the help of different agents like wind, insects, animals, water, etc. Once the pollen grains reaches the stigma of a suitable flower, a tube grows from the pollen grain. This tube grows through the style and reaches the ovary. The male gametes from the pollen travel through this tube and reaches the female gamete present in the ovule of the ovary. Look at the picture of a carpel. In this carpel, it contains only one ovule. And that ovule contains total 8 cells. The middle cells are called polar nuclei. Two nucleus. So polar nuclei. And the below you can see 3 cells are there. Middle cell is the female gamete or the egg cell. And upper 3 cells are there. The function of these cells you will study in the higher class. Now you concentrate on the middle cell, that is egg cell. When the pollen tube grows through the style and reaches to the ovule, it will enter through the micropyle. You can see there is a gap. This ovule is covered, it is not covered completely. There is a small gap. That gap is called micropyle. So the pollen tube will enter through this micropyle. The male gametes enter to the ovule through micropyle. And inside the ovule there are 8 cells are there. Now 2 male gametes also entering. Now the next step is the fertilization. Here there is not one fertilization. Here there will be double fertilization because there are 2 male gametes. The first fertilization between the male gamete and the egg cell. That means the female gamete. Male gamete fuse with the female gamete to form zygote. That is the first fertilization. Next, the second fertilization. The second male gamete fuse with the polar nuclei, which is present in the middle of the ovule. Male gamete fuse with the polar nuclei to form endosperm. Okay, this double fertilization. Male gamete plus female gamete gives zygote. It is the first fertilization. Male gamete plus the polar nuclei gives endosperm. That is the second fertilization. Once again we can see the double fertilization in flowering plants. In the first figure it is labeled the cells present in the ovule. Above 3 antipodal cells and the middle 2 nuclei, it is called polar nuclei, and the below 3 cells are there. Middle one is the egg cell or the female gamete. Either side of the egg cell it is called synergids. Okay, and here function of the synergids is if egg cell is damaged, if the egg cell is not in a working condition, at that situation, one of the synergids will fuse with the male gamete and form the zygote. And look at the middle picture. Here the pollen tube enters through the micropyle and it is releasing the male gametes to the ovule. And one of the male gamete will fuse with the egg cell and another male gamete will fuse with the polar nuclei. After the fusion, all the other cells will disappear. That means antipodal cells and the synergids will disappear and will form only two cells. That is called endosperm and the zygote. After double fertilization, only two cells will be there in the seed, that is endosperm and zygote. Zygote is the fusion between two cells, male gamete and the egg cell. It contains two nucleus, that's why in bracket of zygote it is written 2n. Endosperm, it is the fusion of three nuclei, that's why it is written there 3n. The zygote divides several times to form an embryo inside the ovule. Ovule changes to seed and ovary ripens and forms the fruit around the seed. This zygote further develops into an embryo. After fertilization, the ovary develops into the fruit and the ovules into seeds. The ovule develops a tough coat and is gradually converted into a seed. Inside the seed, it contains embryo and endosperm. For germination process, endosperm will provide nutrients for the growth of the embryo. The factors affecting the germination process are the correct temperature and the moisture. So water will enter through the micropyle. There will be a small hole in the seed. Through that hole the water will enter. When the seed gets the correct temperature, this embryo start growing into seedlings. This is the diagram which shows the germination of seed. When the embryo develops into a seedling, it will grow upward and downward direction. The upward, when the embryo grows upward directly to the sunlight, is plumule, which is the future shoot of the plant. And the embryo growing downward towards the gravitational force is the radicle, which is the future root of the plant. And cotyledons are the part of endosperm which store food and provide food for the germination process. And the factors affecting germination process are moisture, the presence of water, and the temperature. Correct temperature also needed for the growth of seed.